Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth conversation in a series of online discussions that are organized by 1014 and the ACG under the heading Democracies Under Pressure, Challenges for the Global Liberal Order. In recent years, we've seen internal and external challenges to democracy and a waning trust in democratic institutions and practices. But Putin's war in Ukraine has underscored yet another challenge to democracy. In this series, we're trying to answer the question, will the liberal rules-based world order survive this blatant breach of national sovereignty and humanitarian law that even multilateral organizations have been unable to prevent or stop? Joining us today to talk about the democratic fallout of the war in Ukraine are two experts on Eastern Europe. We are truly honored to welcome Professor Dr. Gwendolyn Sasse and Dr. Alexander Cooley. Gwendolyn Sasse is the director of the Center for East European and International Studies and also serves as Einstein Professor for the Comparative Study of Democracy and Authoritarianism at the Humboldt-Universität in Berlin. Gwen also participated in the ACG's Young Leaders Study Group on the Future of Europe. Herzlich willkommen. It is great to see you again. Also with us is Alexander Cooley. He's Professor of Political Science and Vice Provost for Academic Centers and Libraries at Barnard College here in New York City, and he also serves as Academy Adjunct faculty at Chatham House. Alex, it's terrific to see you again as well. Before we get started, I have one housekeeping point. I want to remind everybody that ACG and 1014 are both independent, nonpartisan organizations, and the views expressed during this conversation are those of our guests.
So let me start this conversation with the two experts. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's hop right into the situation in Ukraine. So with the forced referendum in the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine and the proclaimed annexation of these 4 territories by Russia, democracy and sovereignty of a former Soviet state are once again undercut by hegemonial aspirations. But at the same time, Russians are fleeing their homeland in large numbers. These developments raise questions concerning the broader implications of the war in Ukraine. So let's look at Ukraine. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about, from the so-called referendum to the illegal annexation of more territory, to the recruiting of reservists in Russia, and not to mention the attack on the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to Russia over the weekend, and yesterday's onslaught of missile attacks by Russia. But Gwen, so you have a new book coming out in 2 days, Der Krieg gegen die Ukraine, Hintergründe, Ereignisse, Folgen. In a nutshell, can you explain how did we get to where we are?
Yes, I try in this small book to tackle this big question, and I think we could easily kind of put forward a rather simple explanation and say it's all started in Putin's head, and that's what we're seeing. But I think it's better to think of Putin as, of course, the key figure, the catalyst, but a catalyst needs certain developments, certain conditions on which he or she can act. And I lay out a number of developments that I think were kind of developments shaping an increasing likelihood of an all-out war. But then there was no necessity to this either. So I think that's important, and that's important to me. So I think there is an increasing number of people who seem to have foreseen everything. Usually they are people who didn't really study Russia or Ukraine very much, I think. But that's just an aside. But so I think even those of us who studied it, I think it would be too easy to say that we expected it to happen on this scale and knew all along. I mean, over the last year, yes, the buildup was there of the troops and something what was going to happen, but I think it's a more long-term process, and that also means things could have also gone differently. And I think that's how we should read history and not make it too deterministic from our current vantage point. But among, I talk about sort of 7 different developments I think are important, but the 2 I think are critical, and I think that fits with your theme of the series, is that apart from Putin's and Russian elites talk about NATO expansion and a number of other things that are threats or perceived threats coming from the West and endangering Russian security, I think at the heart of it is a conflict between different political models, different political systems, and ultimately the model Ukraine was turning itself into and is turning itself into, namely a westward-oriented democracy based on the rule of law and those principles, also bears a risk for Russia, and it ultimately clashes with the current political system in Russia, which has a neo-imperial agenda built into it, but it is an authoritarian and increasingly authoritarian system if we go back a few years, so that's been an ongoing process, but it has long not been a democracy. So sometimes democracy is used with these qualifying adjectives, but I don't think that helps at all. And I think at least since Putin became president, it's a gradual increase in this trend. And so ultimately it's about preventing that kind of model that Ukraine has become or had become to also influence Russia and limit Russia internally, but also in its power projections.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to hone into, one thing you mentioned a little bit more, the conflict between different models. And Alex, so I just am curious, let's take a step back, not discuss the recent military developments yet and look at the referendum. So can you perhaps explain the driving logic behind these referendum? Why even bother when it's so obviously not democratic? And, to me, as a non-expert, it seems still a little bit reminiscent of the referenda that were forced on the Baltic, the Polish, the Ukrainians prior to joining the Soviet Union. So what's going on? Why does an autocratic or even, increasingly autocratic state even conduct referenda?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, right? Because, there is this script of sovereignty that has to be followed. And that idea is that you have to provide a justification that this was the popular will, that somehow this has been codified by external observers. So some random external observers were mobilized in other writings, I've called them sort of zombie monitors along with Chris Walker, because they're not good faith election monitors. They're just mobilized in to provide that legitimacy. And these territories have been accepted written into the Russian constitution as members of the Russian Federation. The reason Putin did this was to sort of create this red line that this is done, don't even think about taking it back, that we will bargain and negotiate outside of the parameters of this, and just to signal that, we don't play by your rules anymore. We're going to impose our own rules when it comes to matters of national security, national interest, in the quote-unquote post-Soviet space. The problem that we've seen is even with this might makes right logic, Putin doesn't control the territories that he's annexed. And so this has created multiple dilemmas for him. I think in terms of the other post-Soviet states, the decision not to recognize is relatively easy. This is something that they wouldn't have been involved in themselves in anyway, with the exception of Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. So for the others, it was an easy call. It's an easier call now that the territories themselves are still in the middle of a conflict zone disputed. I think the other question that this brings up is, and Gwen is more of an expert here than anyone, but does this put Crimea status strangely back into play, right? If we're going to have to amend the Russian constitution for 4 new provinces that they don't control, what does this do for recovering the status quo ante in Crimea? So this move was meant to be a power move. It was meant to signal that, in fact, we're going to do things our way. that I think it's created more contradictions and problems for Putin as it's actually solved.
Thank you both. This is a great way of sort of setting the stage. And before we go on to talk about whether we're kind of in a new chapter of the war and a new chapter of the conflict, I want to maybe pick up a couple of the threads that you've both put out there and hone in on them a little bit more. Gwen, you were talking specifically about how there was a perceived threat in Moscow, in the Kremlin, by Putin about the developments that were taking place in Ukraine, that Ukraine was sort of turning to the West and becoming almost a risk to Russia. And Alex, you were talking a little bit about how this is sort of an interesting kind of script of sovereignty, a way in which Moscow has tried to sort of maintain control, but found that that control has been crumbling away. I'd love to hear from each of you how you sort of see this conflict between different models playing out within Russia. Sort of what do people think of what they are observing and what they're hearing, particularly given that they don't have great access to information, but also how some of the countries that used to be kind of under that Soviet umbrella and part of the Russian Federation or even the Soviet Union are reacting and responding to this kind of new pressure and a new situation that they find themselves in, given that there's a hot war in Ukraine right now. Alex, you're nodding, so maybe you could go first, and then Gwen can pick up some ideas.
Yeah, sure. Let me pick up on the kind of the regional aspect of this first, right? I think, we in the West, we had such a unified response to what happened, right? And all of a sudden, within a week, you had kind of coordinated central bank sanctions. You had kind of, these mass expressions of opprobrium, this shock at what was going on. You had the private sector pullout, which turned into an avalanche from the region. Companies like BP, all sorts of histories sort of navigating Russian political risks, thinking this is just too toxic for us. We're going to strand assets. So you had this, as well as the supply, which accelerated of weapons to Ukraine itself, right? Cancellation of Nord Stream, and we could go down the list. So a very unified Western response that, demonstrated on one hand, well, when unified, the liberal Western order, or hegemonic cartel, as Dan Nexon and I like to call it, is indeed extremely powerful. The problem on the post-Soviet side is not that these states don't fear Russian aggression. Of course they do. And when they hear comments that we're going to go to Moldova, we're going to go to Kazakhstan, the Balts are back on the table, Poland, of course they're concerned. But the other kind of force that they're stuck in the middle are these sanctions, right? And so the West is providing opprobrium, sanctions, and compliance risk. And Russia is providing this kind of revisionist, aggressive power that wants to rewrite the rules. What would you do if you were leader of a post-Soviet state? And so we've seen even countries like Georgia that should be sympathetic and are, in terms of public opinion about what is happening in Ukraine, refuse to implement sanctions. And part of this is in self-interest, right? We don't want to unilaterally sort of right away half of our, wine exports or our tourist industry. But part of it is also, where were these massive sanctions when we had a conflict and Russia de facto annexed 20% of our territory? Where was this level of outrage? So there is a little bit of resentment there. I think when you take a country like Kazakhstan, you see clear that President Tokayev wants to distance himself away from these actions. At the same time, public opinion is not overwhelmingly supportive of Russia, of Ukraine. It's actually in Kazakhstan, it's split 50-50, according to the most recent opinion surveys. Some Central Asian states like Kyrgyzstan, it's actually more in favor of Russia than the other way around. So they're navigating these different kinds of competing pressures. And what they land on is this: we won't recognize these annexations, we won't recognize the independence of these entities. And they're going to try and avoid going on the record, right? Because they realize it's important to Russia. So they'll miss the votes, they'll abstain, they'll do what they can to sort of avoid taking a position. The one other dimension of this I think is incredibly important is, you mentioned this, Steve, you know, also Katya too. We've had two waves of outmigration from Russia to the post-Soviet states. The initial one was right after the war started. That involved tens of thousands of IT workers, as well as some journalists getting out, independent thinkers, those who wanted to flee Russia. And recently we've had hundreds of thousands fleeing conscription. Where do they go? They go to places where they can travel visa-free. And these are places like Georgia, Armenia, Turkey, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. And so these institutions that Russia had created, these ordering institutions for regional integration to assert their kind of privilege and their hegemony, are now being repurposed basically to host Russian exiles. And many of these countries are small places that the presence, the inflow of these Russian communities is creating real socioeconomic disruption. We've seen rental prices go through the roof. We've seen, you know, deep uncertainty about, you know, what are their attitudes, what are long-term plans. So Eurasia itself is being remade as a result of this instability in Russia, and that's something I'm keeping my eye on.
Can I just jump in there as well and maybe stick with the sort of the regional and global perspective, and then I'll come back briefly to what this means also for Russia itself, which I think you touched on, Steve, as well. And I completely agree with Alex that I think this is a time when we see what Western institutions like the EU, like NATO, but also institutions like the UN, what they're really based on, and what these values that are often talked about, but now they also have to kind of come with actions, what they really mean. So this is, I think, the biggest asset of the West. But I think at the same time, we see quite clearly that Russia isn't as isolated as we might want to believe in various parts of the West. And I think this reordering of regions, which Alex just mentioned, which is definitely beginning to happen in Eastern Europe, and in particular in Russia's immediate neighborhood, is also happening in other parts of the world. And I think it's a very open-ended process, because if we look at how countries globally have voted on a number of UN resolutions, I don't mean the first one condemning the war, that was a very clear majority with very few exceptions. But since then it's become it's a more diverse pattern. And then if we add to that not only who votes against resolutions, but also who doesn't take part in voting, or who doesn't, which countries do not stick to various parts of the sanctions regime, or deliberately sort of undermine it. That is happening in all regions of the world, and it's not a clear-cut kind of one region facing another, and it's also not a clear-cut dichotomy between democracies and authoritarian states. So I think while we, on the one hand, see those distinctions between these different political models very clearly, but if we look at countries like India, Indonesia, they are not complying with the sanctions, and at least I don't know where we exactly place them, but we wouldn't place them clearly on the authoritarian end of the spectrum. So, you know, we see this, and I think there is an overlay also of past colonial experiences coming through, which at least in Europe, I think, catch governments by surprise, that Russia's message, and very targeted message to, for example, various African countries, is heard, and countries want to stay neutral, either for economic interests or because they are dependent as well, because of various legacies, but also because they haven't fared very well in the past. So the message coming from the West is only in parts attractive. So I think that is also something we see very clearly at this moment of of crisis, and how that reorders regions. I think it's no longer going to be sort of Latin America. Maybe it was never a centralized regions anyway, but I think it will become more diverse in regions like Latin America, Africa, Asia, in addition to Russia's immediate neighborhood. And just briefly on Russia, I mean, I think it could go in very different directions, and it's very hard to speculate. But we could see the effect of this war immediately was a further strengthening of the autocratic system, and a system that has to rely even more on control of complete control of the media. So everything that wasn't state-run was closed down or was forced into exile. And repression has been massively stepped up. But what we see now too is that from within the system, there's pressure on Putin. There isn't that much pressure yet that he needs to seriously worry about from society. This might happen, but the protests we see around mobilization that is happening in some locations, and that is something that is still away from calling for a change at the top. But what he is reacting to, and we can see the escalation in the war dynamics again, in particular yesterday's attacks on the whole of Ukraine, really cities, again air attacks, is in part, and probably the most part of that is trying to appease hardliners within the elites and buying himself time. So that suggests, although it's very hard to look into those interactions, elite interactions, because it is such a closed and personalized system by now, but we can see that that is what he's at least trying to deal with first, and that bears also a number of risks for instability. I mean, on the one hand, it could bring change, but it also means it won't bring the change that maybe in the West we would hope for.
Thank you so much. So you know, that leads right to another question. So with all this uncertainty about what's happening in Russia and all this, you know, we don't really know, you know, are there forces that can, you know, manage a change, or, you know, are the autocratic forces too strong, sort of, and will contradict us? I think you also always, you know, pointed out the unpredictability of the war in Ukraine and how it's going to unfold. Carnegie Europe on September 13, you had an article, and, you know, you basically said, you know, even given the recent gains by Ukrainian forces, you know, this does not automatically mean that the Ukraine is on the trajectory to victory, basically. So you're very cautious in your assessment. So right now, of course, with all the recent developments, one of the key questions is whether the Ukraine can hold its gains in the east and the south, and, you know, what are the conditions on the ground after the missile attacks now by Russia. So what do you think? Where are we at this? Where are we at this critical point?
Is that addressed to me?
Yes, it's addressed the follow-on.
Yeah. I mean, it seems, but we've said that a number of times already, and I think we will keep saying it, because I don't think there's any quick end of this war coming up. So I think this is something that will go on for months, definitely into next year. Who knows? Maybe longer. Maybe it will be something that goes in cycles. So I think that is sort of at the moment a more likely scenario rather than something ending anytime soon. On the ground, it has not been going well for Russia, and the problems have been very, very obvious. It's an issue of personnel, of logistics, but also of an inflexible, ultimately inside the military, an inflexible command structure. And the Ukrainian forces fight very differently, are much more flexible in how they can respond. And then we've seen in these Ukrainian counteroffensives how, probably to the surprise of many, probably the Ukrainian troops themselves, how the Russian forces have left, and sometimes rather chaotically fled. But I think that should not, as we saw yesterday, that should not make us believe that this is now kind of the only development in this war. I don't see Russia in a position to quickly recapture the once again lost territory now that is held by the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians can advance as quickly as they have in recent weeks, is also in question, and the winter is looming, so they're trying to recover as much ground as they can, and then it will probably quite literally freeze. But Russia has demonstrated that it has other options, and you can escalate with attacking against cities, which reminded everybody of the beginning of this invasion in February. And also Kiev hadn't been bombarded since the early summer, and the aim is clear: to hit infrastructure, to hit deliberately civilians and civilian infrastructure, and to demoralize the population and to scare the population, the Ukrainian population. That is not successful at the moment. It's a question also if Russia can now do this repeatedly, or if it has the resources to do that. But it's not affecting directly, I would say, at the moment, and maybe in the foreseeable kind of next few months, what's happening on the ground, where the actual front lines are, and they're sort of different ones, and they keep changing, as we discussed. But it does show that one shouldn't underestimate sort of a number of options Russia has to escalate, and it will use, at least the one it has used, it will use again.
Yeah. Alex, I'm curious what you think about, the power of, the capacity of Russian forces sort of to continue what they're doing. And, what's from a US perspective, how is this war unfolding? And also, Russia now explicitly names the West as a target in this war. So, what are your thoughts on that? And then, of course, the big elephant in the room, it's the nuclear threat. So I hand that over. What do you think about that now?
Yeah, sure. So for Russia, this has always been about the West, right? I mean, this isn't new necessarily, and Russian commentators frame this consistently. This is the last straw. This is the final showdown. The contradictions have come to a head. In fact, for some Russians, this is about everything but Ukraine, which seems really strange given some of the genocidal rhetoric and justifications that have come out about Ukrainian identity. There is a kind of cathartic release about all of these grievances that have been harbored in the post-Cold War era. Everything we've heard something a lot about NATO expansion, but it's about Kosovo, it's about the projection of liberal universal rights. It's about this just potpourri of what Putin regards as kind of the pernicious spread of liberalism, and the fact that the West seeks to control it. In this speech, particularly like the Crimea speech, he talked about not only double standards, sort of triple standards of sort of hypocrisy, right? So there is this obsession with the West and rulemaking. And this is why, it's inseparable. This idea that, whatever happens in Ukraine is really a final demarcation against Western incursion. In terms of the nuclear option, of course, there's been more discussion about that lately, especially as Russia has lost on the battlefield. Questions about, if Putin's survival himself is threatened, right? Switching from a national interest to a regime survival perspective, whether he would hesitate to play the nuclear card. Not to be depressing, but it's not at all clear to me that the use of a tactical nuclear weapon potentially would be clearly attributed, or that it would arouse the level of indignation globally among swing states like India, like China, like Brazil, that we assume it would be. Maybe it would, but maybe it wouldn't. I think one of the things that we forget in the West about this conflict is the kind of moral revulsion that we felt is not necessarily shared in other parts of the world. Yes, there's concern. Yes, there's sympathy with the Ukrainians, but we've seen other really destructive conflicts. Iraq, Afghanistan, ISIS, Democratic Republic of Congo, all sorts of really bad conflicts out there. And so when Russia taps into this, as Gwen was saying, they play on these ideas, right? The fact that they want you to be outraged now, but where was the outrage about colonialism? Where was the outrage that you're being made vassals? Where was the outrage when they hypocritically use democracy to enact regime change? These are the themes that are playing out. So to return we need to look at this holistic, right? That part of the Russian campaign here is to message globally and to message about dissatisfaction with international order. And they've been more successful with that than we like to give them credit, precisely because we're focused on what's going on in Europe and European unity and coherence, as well as what's going on in Ukraine. One final point here. The democracy angle, because I know this is the theme of the seminar, I think certainly the Ukrainians present this as part of their democratic strength and democratic battle. And certainly, in fact, the success of the territorial defense forces is predicated on a lot of democratic reforms and this decentralization and sort of the strengthening of civil society that they have and so forth. But to me, more effective messaging, both in the post-Soviet region and across the global South, would emphasize the violation of sovereignty. Democracy is a very loaded term right now, in part because it has been wielded hypocritically, because it has been associated with state collapse and regime change. Whereas if you focus the messaging on the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine being invaded and violated by Russia, I think it's a more resonant message. So just some, some food for thought there. But certainly militarily, we're in a new stage, and I would say for Putin, we're not there yet. The signaling and coercion that comes from nuclear brinksmanship, this is what you would expect, whether he intended them to use or not. He wants to signal that everything is on the table, but certainly this means a lot more to Putin personally than the potential sort of Western response.
Thank you so much. And Gwen, I'm just curious, if you share this assessment, is this about everything else but Ukraine? And I mean, other people also talk about the proxy war in Ukraine. What do you think? What's your assessment on that?
Yeah, I do think it is also about Ukraine. And as I was trying to say at the very beginning, Russia's sort of fight against everything it associates with kind of liberalism in the sense of liberal democracies, because Russia is economically, it's a completely liberal state with some exceptions, but and maybe a trend pointing in an opposite direction now, but we have to be clear about this too. So it's what we mean by liberal or illiberal. But it is this is personified by Ukraine, sort of this battle against that, and that kind of model, as I was saying at the beginning, was coming too close from Putin's perspective for comfort. So I think it is in that sense, it is about Ukraine, but it is also about larger issues behind that. But it is also, and that is where kind of I think Putin's kind of personal influence comes in his own writings. Clearly over the last few years there have been further shifts, and the obsession with Ukraine and Ukraine not being an independent state, an independent nation, that is, we can trace that through his writings and speeches, and that has become much more extreme compared to even where he in his already pretty extreme rhetoric was a few years ago. And even during since the invasion in February now, it has further change. So it's not kind of regime change in Kiev, but it's really eradicating the state and the nation. So it has to do with Ukraine, but it stands for other issues as well. And in that sense, I think proxy war to me sounds a bit too distant and as if it's just a tool. So I think it's more than that, but the two are linked.
As we think about sort of this regional dimension and this regional focus, especially in light of what you were just saying, Gwen, but also what you were talking about a little bit earlier, Alex, about the territorial integrity and the sovereignty, I'd like to maybe look at kind of the impact in the South Caucasus and Central Asia, because it seems as if Russia's domination of that region is really sort of unraveling, and we're seeing conflicts throughout the region, concerns about new tinderboxes that threaten to create distractions for all of us as well. Earlier this month, there was a brief but pretty bloody border conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. So as you sort of look at the region, and Alex, I'd like to start with you and then bring Gwen in. What do you think is going to happen there as Moscow sort of loses its grip on sort of the region to the east, because it is so focused and embroiled on the war in Ukraine?
Steve, thanks for the question. And I think the observation is a very timely one. I would reframe it in the following way. I don't think it's that Moscow is losing its grip. It's losing the veneer that it had a grip, right? And so Moscow has, for the last 15, 20 years, has always wanted to do two things that we assumed went together, but not always. One is project this as a sphere of its own privileged influence, as Medvedev said after the Georgian War. And to do that, it set up a bunch of regional organizations in the security and economic sphere that mimicked Western counterparts, the CSTO in NATO, the Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union, to sort of give a kind of ordering architecture to its efforts to exert control, to exert influence. In fact, the 2014 crisis was sparked by then President Yanukovych's refusal, doing a 180 on deciding to join the Eastern Partnership. This is what led to the protests at Maidan Square. In reality, however, Russia has, in its kind of this desire, this almost obsession to push the West out and to counter the West, has cut informal deals with other quasi-Western, non-Western powers, certainly with China and Central Asia, where the Chinese do exert a security presence even in Central Asia. They're just very careful to sort of defer to Russia publicly. And then since 2020, frankly, together with Turkey, in the aftermath of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, where frankly, Russian peacekeepers were coordinating with also a Turkish presence. And it was clear that it was sort of anyone but the West, right? If they could sort of maintain order. What's happened now is that you see Russia can't become involved in conflicts. They can't respond to CSTO questions of sort of alliance commitments. They've always refused to in the past, but they've given sort of legal reasons why they didn't get involved in Kyrgyzstan in 2010 and Armenia in 2020. Now the Armenians flat out asked them, it's not just Nagorno-Karabakh, sovereign Armenian territory is being attacked by Azerbaijan. Please assist us. And they said, no, right? We'll set up a committee and so forth. This is, I think, the final kind of removal. The emperor has no clothes, because Russia wants to have the image of controlling the region, being associated with the region, but it doesn't want to take sides, right? When there are sort of different Soviet peripheries involved. That one's more direct. I would say the Central Asian case is a little bit more indirect. Here we have, this is a second round of conflict. The first was last year in April 2021. There are sort of some, resources involved, some nationalism and sort of chest thumping on both sides. The sort of showcasing of some new drones and toys that sort of fuel this, as well as some authoritarian dynamics in that President Rahmon of Tajikistan would rather talk about conquering these exclaves and enclaves rather than his crackdown in certain parts of the country. But again, the same logic apply. Russia is not going to clash heads, right? It's not going to tell these countries to behave, not when it needs their sort of support. And so it's being increasingly exposed as not being able to provide the one thing it's supposed to provide in the region, which is stability and order.
Gwendolyn, how do you see the situation? I mean, a little bit earlier, you were talking a little bit about the pattern kind of at the UN level, that there's not really much of a pattern. It's difficult to see, or it's easy to see who's abstaining and who's trying to stay neutral in all of this. But can you talk a little bit about how that's playing out specifically in the post-Soviet states, as well as they, try to stay neutral on some levels, keep Russia at arm's length, but are still a little concerned, obviously very concerned about Russia's actions?
Yes, I think you've summed it up there yourself. So I think it's being concerned and probably also being entirely sure how to position themselves now. No, I completely agree with you, Alex, that in particular the veneer has come off all these different attempts spearheaded by Russia, creating regional organizations, no, be they more economic or be they more security focused, and I think that's clearly sort of has come apart, but nevertheless, I mean, Russia, as we just mentioned, the case of Nagorno-Karabakh clearly was an important actor, and of course for entirely for its own because of its own interests, nevertheless acted as a stabilizing force. Also others were not really present or could do this. So what we see now, that in particular with Azerbaijan going far beyond the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, and there's no pushback, and yes, Turkey's role is important too, but that shows that I mean, simply by being there or a lack of other regional actors, Russia did also act as this force that could stabilize, be it through dependencies or by kind of playing different sides in one region or part of a region. So I think that is more sort of, this is now up for grabs, and those who think like Azerbaijan think they can extend their power both territorially, at the same time knowing that also parts of the West, Europe is dependent on energy resources, so there's sort of more leeway there. So this is part, I think, of this reordering of an open-ended reordering, I think, of regional power relations. But Azerbaijan, I think, is the clearest case. And then the Central Asian states, we get a sense that some of the authoritarian presidents are kind of also kind of waiting and not trying to align themselves too closely with Russia, but also it's not clear what the alternative is, and it's not all going to point in the China direction either. So, and they're not all acting as a bloc as Central Asia, for example, either. So I think that again is more a sense at the moment of uncertainty, trying to not get sort of too close to Russia, but not to anybody else either, while waiting, and while also, which is an interesting historical reverse, having kind of, as we mentioned briefly before, quite a few migrants arriving from, fleeing from Russia to Central Asia. So also an interesting kind of reversal of kind of the trends in recent years. And just to kind of the final point, I mean, on different levels, so Putin and the system he represents and he built, I mean, ironically, is losing kind of a lot of influence that has either persisted beyond kind of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or was deliberately built again by all kinds of economic and also organizational means in the region, with one exception, and that's Belarus. But so that relationship cannot sort of outweigh kind of the influence Russia had and was playing in different parts flexibly before. So it doesn't have that room, but it has one much closer ally, and Lukashenko is clearly completely dependent on Putin, which however also means that he might be gone at some point too.
Thank you so much. So this is really such a fascinating analysis to see what's happening in the region, and also look at Turkey and China and how they, you know, fill the void in some extent that Russia leaves. And it's all fascinating. Also from an economic point, of course, you know, with you know, states increasingly looking to China economically to increase their ties. But let's even take a bigger picture than that. Alex, you know, you research a lot on illiberalism, and even before the war in Ukraine started, you wrote an article in Foreign Affairs that just, you know, laid out, you know, your thoughts of where this is all heading. I read it, and there was one thing that really struck me. You said 2005 was the last year that had an increase in global democracy, according to Freedom House. Now, I guess the situation looks probably even more dire. So, or not, you know, we'll have to see how this is all unfolding. some politicians and scholars, such as the ex-German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer, are even saying we're going back to Cold War. And, you know, we mentioned that in the course of the discussion already. So what is your overall take on the state of democracy, given the war in Ukraine?
Democracy is currently being challenged. And yeah, we've seen a steady rollback of democratic indicators and practices over the last 17 years. Certainly we can consider 2004, I would consider sort of peak liberal ordering, right? That's when we just had the expansion of the transatlantic community, both NATO and the European Union. We actually had the US engaged in Central Asia, you know, militarily, along with NATO allies. And all of this starts to unravel. And then we start seeing pockets of withdrawal, including from Afghanistan, you know, itself, just in 2021, and how much this shaped Putin's thinking in terms of timing and potential Western unity, I think is also an interesting topic for discussion. You know, clearly, I think the sort of lack of coordination there and the seeming chaos and the projection of this kind of Saigon type scenario and weakness, I think, also emboldened him. But the illiberal forces are there, right? And certainly, you know, Ukrainian victories are tactical, but I think sort of strategically, sort of overall, we're seeing is authoritarians aren't just being defensive anymore, right? They're not just kind of blocking and shielding themselves from democratic pressures. They're on the offensive. They're trying to repurpose and transform international and regional organizations. They're trying to change definitions of what security and terrorism mean to include political opposition. They are mounting increasingly sophisticated disinformation campaigns. And frankly, a lot of this is an own goal on the part of the West when we see Russia and China expanding their global media presence, right? Establishing foreign bureaus. Remember when we had those? And then the recent announcements of, you know, institutions like the BBC cutting back their foreign language broadcasting service. So all of this news coverage, wire services, all these things have gone into the global bloodstream about what kinds of topics are covered. It's not even about covering China or Russia positively. It's about what's legitimate news, what's the agenda setting, what kinds of stories are being covered. And so in all of these sorts of areas, domains that we once considered unrivaled Western liberal soft power, we're seeing concerted pushback. And I'm afraid that's how even what seems to us a very kind of clear-cut case of Russian invasion in Ukraine starts becoming muddled and complicated once it gets filtered through some of these new illiberal institutions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Just briefly, I mean, I fully agree, and that is the sort of the global trend. But I think at the same time, this war now also makes us kind of see and appreciate again what the international rules-based order, if it still exists, I mean, what its founding principles are, no, and what it means that we actually that territorial integrity or sovereignty, as we discussed it beforehand, is sort of a baseline there, or what Ukrainians are ultimately fighting for, also in terms of their own rights inside their state. So it's both kind of relations between states, but also inside. So in many ways, I think kind of the very basic principles of democracy, but also of this international law, become very apparent to everyone, and not only political elites but also societies. No, so this is I think, or at least parts of the globe. So if we now focus on the West, I think that is something like this. We haven't, I mean, maybe in Europe at least 1989 might have been a similar moment, but I think it's another moment where that becomes very apparent, and that might also lead, optimistically thinking, to kind of shift the emphasis on to get basically also one's own house in order. I mean, many also Western democracies have authoritarian tendencies within them, illiberal tendencies within them. So it could also be kind of a starting point for tackling that more. But I think, and I think the bigger risk is that the fallout from this war, and we'll see it, and we're already beginning to see it, but we'll see it more in Europe, in different parts of Europe over the winter. Sort of the effects of also the sanctions regime on Western democracies, and in particular in Europe, will societies be as kind of will they be kind of supporting solidarity with Ukraine as much as they have so far? I mean, both with regard to large numbers of displaced in some parts of Europe, but also with regard to the costs that every individual now has to bear. And that is more the case I live in Germany, so a country that made very risky and wrong choices in terms of energy dependencies on one authoritarian state, namely Russia. And now that is already, you can feel it. And where's that discontent going to go? Is it going to, so that's going to be, I think, in several parts, at least of Europe, a further test of democracy on top of already, as Alex said, kind of illiberal trends in most systems. That's a huge test of democracy in I think a number of crises inside the EU. Basically, it's almost every crisis it has had, and over the last few years, from a financial crisis to all kinds of other crises and refugee crises, as it was called, and now the war on top of that is sort of all of these crises in one and more, and you need to find a response to that. So I think, and where's that sort of possible public discontent going to go? That I think is a big risk for democracies within, that is directly linked to this war.
Gwen, I think you've really put your finger on a nerve there. I think one of the big questions a lot of people are asking is will the unity, will the support hold on a domestic level in countries like Germany, where still over 70% of the public says in polls that support for Ukraine is the right thing to do. But then, of course, also how the Western Alliance will hold together. I mean, I think that these are really key questions that we'll be exploring in the months to come. As we sort of start to come to an end here, though, I want to go back to the beginning of our conversation, because Gwen, you said things could have gone differently, and you've both said that this war is likely to continue for quite some time. And I guess one of the questions that I grapple with is, how can this war come to an end if there's no willingness to negotiate? Because it certainly seems as if Putin is not willing to negotiate. There are, periodically articles, comments about, is there a face-saving way out for Putin? But certainly with the ratcheting up of his attacks, there does not seem to be a willingness to negotiate right now. And yet, having said that, it was just reported, I think this morning, that President Putin has indicated he'd be willing to meet with President Biden on the periphery of the G7 summit if Biden were willing to meet with him. And one of our viewers asks the question, does this mean that Putin is looking for a way out and would like to discuss it with President Biden? And I'd be interested to hear from each of you whether you think there's sort of a way out sooner rather than later. Alex or Gwen, yeah, you unmuted first, so why don't you go first?
I mean, basically, it's the question that also a lot of journalists always ask. And also, what's Putin thinking, and what will he do? And we don't know. I mean, there have been many times, also since February, where he could have argued, presented something as a victory and withdrawn, but it didn't happen. So that means it wasn't enough. There was no room for negotiation. And what seems important to me is that one might almost forget that even in the first few days after the beginning of the invasion in February, the Ukrainians put a lot on the table. No? Zelensky put things like neutrality on the table, put on the table, let's move back to before February. So that means Crimea and parts of Donbass would have still been out of bounds for Ukraine for at least a long time. But then, of course, I mean, Putin did not respond. Russia did not respond to that. There was no willingness whatsoever to seriously negotiate on the Russian side. And since then, so much has happened, and also with the amount of war crimes that have been discovered, there is currently no space for Ukraine to directly negotiate with Russia, even if Russia signaled. And if Russia signaled it wanted to, unfortunately, we know what that would mean. I mean, at the moment, only Russia could gain from a ceasefire and regroup, and at any moment in time start again, and that could then be over many years. So it's sad to say that, but I think in the current situation, Ukraine cannot negotiate, and Russia doesn't see so far, I think, the need to, and also doesn't want to. But in terms of, I was asked this morning by a journalist, does diplomacy mean one is too much on Putin's side if one tried? And I thought that's obviously misunderstanding what diplomacy is, no? And in Germany, various parties and individuals get very worked up when Chancellor Scholz talks on the phone with Putin. And I think, I mean, diplomacy and these types of links, I mean, they're not negotiations. They cannot be, and Ukraine isn't involved in them, and that's not possible as a negotiation. But of course, you try and also lay down your lines, your policies, so you can also kind of communicate clearly what you will and will not do. But you also need to see that you don't miss a moment, and maybe a moment in when there could be more of an elite struggle at some point of whatever kind in Russia. So and you can't miss that moment that might change things completely. And the other aspect of diplomacy, but again, it's not negotiations to end the war, is that it's obviously highly important, as it's going on already, to have at different levels, in particular between the US and Russia, talks to both to deter, but also to manage the risk of nuclear escalation. And I would think that is what this potential meeting is about, and that per se is a good thing. But I cannot see how you would get from there to negotiating peace in Ukraine. But if that is already, of course, one important aspect of risk, and if that is, at least if there's an attempt to address that, then that can only be a good thing. But I would be skeptical that anything comes from it, because they tried before at that level and it didn't work. Yeah,
I agree. And I think there's almost this obsession with trying to revert to how things were before. Hey, can't we just figure out a way to freeze this and go back to the good old days? It's not going to happen. Whatever comes out, what actual enduring settlement is going to require a dramatic type of greater kind of agreement about regional architecture and rules, as well as an agreement on the sanctions. It's all going to have to be part of it. And unless Ukraine is willing to take that step, it's a non-starter. There's just basic credibility issues that both sides have right now to get anything meaningful going. One final point, though, about giving Putin an off-ramp. I understand why this is such a concern, especially with the nuclear saber rattling going on. But the fact of the matter is, Putin could declare victory right now. If it's broadcast over Pervy Canal, most Russians will go along with it, right? I mean, I think this is what we have to remember. Everything is absolutely vital and so forth until the Kremlin says it's not. And what we know from the way public opinion polls are structured and the way things are asked in Russia, the top still has an enormous influence in how things are perceived. Until now, the Russian public hasn't been asked to sacrifice. This was a special military operation going on in a neighboring country. Now with conscription and partial mobilization, you see the nervousness, the mood of society has decidedly changed. There are real sort of social stakes now. So I think, any kind of question about a ceasefire or peace process, even if Russia didn't get what it initially wanted, if it were presented in a favorable way, I think the Russian public would go along, not exempting those, nationalist voices sort of Gwen talked about. So I don't think we should give too much credence to this idea that Putin absolutely has to save face. He's been making the reality of perceptions in Russia for some time now.
Thank you both. I mean, those are incredibly insightful comments from both of you, and I'm realizing, listening to these last two inputs, that I would have loved to have spent some time today talking a little bit about sort of what the possible political and strategic objectives are of the West for a period after the conflict, right? What's the long-term strategy toward Russia? Because there will be a post-Ukraine war period, and hopefully people are already starting to think about what that will look like and what a sustainable and stable security architecture can look like for the region. But maybe that just means we have to have you back again for that conversation. From my part, this has been really thoughtful and thought-provoking, and I'd like to thank both of you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you so much also from my point of view, and then also thank you to the audience for tuning in to our discussion today. We'll have a few more talks this year, so stay tuned. We'll let you know. Gwen and Alex, thank you so much for joining us. This was really super fascinating. And as Steve said, I think there's a lot more to talk about. So maybe we have another talk in a few months. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.